Okay, so we're going to be talking about Aquinas and his 5 ways. And hopefully the video will catch me, and if not, at least the audio should come through. Okay, so the 5 ways of Aquinas are meant to be ballpark arguments. And what I mean by that is, these are arguments that are supposed to bring you into the neighborhood of God, but not necessarily point to a necessary existence of God. So this is contrasting to Anselm's arguments, right? Anselm's argument is basically concerned with proving the necessary existence of God. And it's a very Platonic sort of argument. It requires Platonic ontology in order to function. Aquinas is an Aristotelian, okay? And it should be mentioned that at the time that Aquinas was alive, the Catholic Church was putting people in jail for the crime of being an Aristotelian. Because when Aristotle resurfaces into the Western society after the Crusades, since Aristotle disagreed with Platonic ideology and Platonic doctrine had been incorporated into Christian doctrine by Augustine, we basically end up in this situation where Aristotle is now disagreeing with Christianity. Okay? Aquinas is the major figure that says, now hold on a minute, we can reconcile Christian doctrine with Aristotelian doctrine, okay? And this is a high point in the history of the church in the sense of that synthesis being allowed. And then after Aquinas' death, you see a move away from that. So because Aquinas is an Aristotelian, that's going to cause him to look at the world and the methodologies that we should use to understand the world a little bit differently, right? Aristotelians are going to be concerned with go out into the world, experience the world, and then engage in philosophical reflection about the world in order to understand something about it. That's going to be their primary methodology. So from that perspective, Aristotle, on Aquinas' view, can be useful in getting us to understand something about God, okay? So Aquinas' discussion is going to be more of a demonstration than a strict proof. What he's trying to do is basically to say, this is what the world is like. And on the basis of what the world is like, we can come to certain conclusions about it. And those conclusions come to make us understand that there exists a being that is in the neighborhood of God, okay? So these 5 ways are not supposed to be drag out foolproof proofs of God's existence. It's more like Aquinas is saying God is in Hyde Park, and this is how we get to Hyde Park. And then once you're in Hyde Park, you need to find God for yourself. And that's going to be done through either mystical experiences or through other aspects of revealed religion. And I mention mystical experiences because Aquinas very famously had some mystical experiences, and they caused him to doubt this idea that you can learn about God or learn in general through books. And so at one point, he ends up throwing the Summa Theologica into the fire, and his secretary rescues it and makes sure that it goes into publication. But Aquinas himself does not write thereafter. And he dies when he's about 50, give or take. But for the last 10 years of his life, he was not involved in any writing.
Because he didn't
believe that
affect people's...
books weren't relevant to learning?
Well, he basically believed that what we should be concerned with is going out and experiencing the world and trying to have mystical sorts of experiences in order to come to understand God's existence. Not necessarily that you would be persuaded through reading.
He doesn't agree with people telling you this is the way it is, so let's figure it out.
Mostly. Okay, so in terms of the 5 ways, the first 3 are going to follow pretty much a very similar structure. And then 4 and 5 are going to be a little different, okay? So my plan here is that I'm going to go through and do argument 1 in a lot of detail, and then I'll show you how argument 2 and argument 3 are similar to argument 1, and then we'll do 4 and 5 in a little bit more thoroughness, okay? So the idea here is that, first of all, Thomas doesn't think that this is the last word on God's existence by any stretch of the imagination. He's just trying to get us to be in the right neighborhood of understanding. And then also that a lot of these arguments have to do with this notion of thinking about things in terms of cause and effect. So the idea is that if you witness an effect, then you can work backwards from that effect to its cause, right? So if I come into a room and I see that a vase is knocked over and the flowers and water are everywhere, I can come to the conclusion that something must have happened in order to cause the vase to be knocked over. And say for the sake of argument that no one has had any sort of inkling that there was an earthquake and that the only being capable of knocking over the vase was the cat, then I would come to the conclusion that the cat must have knocked over the vase, right? And I come to that conclusion really fairly quickly, right? I open the room, I see that the vase is on the floor, I see the cat, and I say, bad cat, you knocked over the vase, right? And none of us find that particularly controversial, that we look at the effect and work backwards to the cause. So Aquinas is going to basically be using that same thought process, but he's going to use it to reach an understanding of ultimate cause, okay? So the first argument is the argument from motion, okay? And Aquinas begins by pointing out that the world is in motion. So if you would just take a moment to look out the window, you will notice that the branch is moving. And right before I said it, there was somebody who was walking by past the window. And I'm sure that if you stare out the window long enough, you will see other things in motion, right? People walking by, cars driving by, perhaps a squirrel running around and throwing nuts at the ground. However you want to think of it, it appears that the world is in motion. I'm in motion right now as I'm talking to you, okay? Not a controversial claim at all. Things are moving. Okay, thanks Aquinas for telling us the obvious. But what he's going to say is, okay, if something is moving, then it must be the case that something moved it. That it must have been moved, okay? So if we want to do this in terms of letters, we can say, okay, I notice that Z is moving. Well, what caused Z to move? Y. And Y was moving, so what caused it to move? X. And we can keep working backwards until we say, well, wait a minute. What caused movement to begin in the first place? Okay? So the idea here is that we have a series of movement that is occurring. And it might help to think about it in terms of if you have a series of dominoes. And imagine for a second that we videotaped the series of dominoes in such a way so that you see the penultimate domino pushing down the last domino. And then we step back and we see the third from the last pushing down the second, right? So kind of like if you've seen the movie Memento, where you're seeing what's happening backwards. At some point, we would have to say, okay, but there must have been someone or something that pushed over the first domino in order for the series to begin falling. Because otherwise, movement could not have occurred at all. So if I witness the second to last domino hitting the last domino, I know that there must have at some earlier point been a first movement that caused the initial series to start falling, even if I don't have the video footage showing that. I would know that that is the case. So if the series of movers is infinite, then there would be no beginning of motion, and if there was no beginning of motion, then there would be no motion. But when I look out the window, I see that the wind is indeed blowing and causing the branch to move. Hence, there is motion in the world. Okay? So Aquinas comes to the conclusion that there must be a first mover, and that mover cannot move. An unmoved mover. What does that sound like?
Oh,
It sounds like Aristotle's notion of an unmoved mover or a prime mover, right? So obviously what Aristotle meant by the unmoved mover and what the Christian St. Thomas Aquinas is going to mean by the unmoved mover is going to be slightly different. And this is part of the reason why it's a neighborhood argument, in the sense that Aquinas is basically going to say that this unmoved mover, everyone understands to be God. Not this is God, but everyone understands that this being, whatever other properties he or she may have, is God. Now, I was trying to get a sense for what it would mean to talk about an unmoved mover, and my last class came up with a goofy example, but I don't know how many of you saw the movie, the remake of Total Recall, but it really doesn't matter. If you've ever seen a movie that involves people having a gunfight in space where there is no gravity, right? So the idea is I'm holding a gun and I want to go up this way and there's no gravity. So if I shoot this way, what ends up happening?
You go back.
The recoil moves me backwards. So I don't know what precisely Aquinas means by an unmoved mover, but I imagine that it would be a mover that could shoot that gun without being moved back
I guess
by the recoil.
my understanding as you're talking is that it's just unchanging. He's just unchanging. The mover. Yeah.
He's saying, well, what he's saying is where's the source of it all coming in from? And obviously it can't be affected by whatever he's affecting back. So I have a theory of what that is actually. I think it's a property of wherever information like gravity and whatnot comes from. I believe it's a separate property of a world that we can never get beyond.
Well, let's come back to this when we talk about the fifth way.
Okay.
Because in the fifth way, Aquinas is going to make some claims about the world being an orderly place and how did it come to be an orderly place. So I think that that's a part of the conversation that we can come back to. So pretty much all of these arguments are going to be very Aristotelian in nature, right? And it is helpful to remember Aristotle's causes as we are going through and doing this argument. So very quickly, you may recall that Aristotle talked about four causes. We have the material cause, which is the materials that are necessary in order to bring the change about. We have the formal cause, which is the essence that tells the oak acorn to become an oak. We have the efficient cause, which is the energy required to bring about the change. And then we have the final cause, which is the final purpose of it all. And the unmoved mover on Aristotle's view is the final cause of the world in the sense that we are all striving towards the prime mover. And that's not quite what Aquinas is going to mean here, right? So recall as you're reading Aristotle that, as you're reading Aquinas, that what he's doing is baptizing Aristotle in some ways, right? He is trying to bring an Aristotelian metaphysics into a Christian theological perspective. And so, of necessity, when that happens, that's going to cause a little bit of your understanding of Aristotle to change and a little bit of your understanding of Christianity to change. So, the second argument is the argument from efficient cause. And it once again begins with this idea of go out into the world and experience it. And when you experience the world, you notice that everything is an effect of some earlier cause. And in addition, that what I think of as having been the cause is in turn an effect of some even earlier cause than that, right? So if you were to say, well, how did I come to being in existence? Well, my mom and my dad, they met and they had an inkling in each other's eye, and that caused me to come into being, right? So they are the cause of the effect that I experience as myself. How did they come into being? Well, my grandparents were once an inkling in each other's eyes that caused me to come, or excuse me, that caused them to come into being, right? So even though they are the cause of the effect that is me, they themselves are the effect of an earlier cause. You can see how this is similar to the argument for motion, except that instead of talking about it in terms of movement, we're now talking about it in terms of cause and effect. So just as in the argument for motion, this chain of cause and effect cannot be infinite. If it were, then nothing would be caused. So there must have been a first cause, and that initial cause was not caused by something else. So we can think of God then as an uncaused causer. Or at least that being an uncaused causer is in the neighborhood of God. The third formulation of the argument is, or the third way, is the argument from possibility and necessity. Okay? So it should be mentioned here that what philosophers mean by possibility, and especially what Aristotle means by possibility, is a little bit confusing, right? We talked about this when we were talking about what he means by potentiality and actuality. And many of you thought, wait, it seems like these terms are kind of being used backwards. And I pointed out to you that linguistic drifts happen, that the ways that we use words changes over time. As a quick comment, for example, a lot of times people will say there's no right to privacy that is explicitly described in the Constitution. And it should be pointed out that privacy at the time that the Bill of Rights was written meant going to the bathroom. So I think we can all agree that A, one should have the right to go to the bathroom, but B, that that's not the sort of thing that you would necessarily explicitly mention in the Constitution. We now have an understanding of privacy that has evolved, right? So in the same way, linguistic practices evolve, and that can sometimes make it difficult to read some of these authors and really understand exactly what they're about, because the ways that they're using these words have changed. So it may be that it's a little bit easier to understand this as we think of it as contingent instead of possible, okay? So my existence was contingent upon my parents existing. And to follow our trend of talking about this in terms of science fiction movies, I'm sure you're all familiar with the movie Back to the Future, right? And there's that one scene where Gordon McFly has engaged in some actions that are causing his parents back in the day not to meet. And what happens to him?
Photograph slowly starts to fade.
He starts to become translucent and fade away, right? There's a way in which, because his existence was contingent upon his parents meeting, when he took actions that were making that event not occur, the universe was warning him about it by saying, hey, wait a minute, you're running the risk of acting in such a way so that you blip yourself out of existence, right? And then he's able to change things around in such a way so that he still ends up existing, because it's a science fiction movie and we have to make it all work out in the end, right? So the idea here is that everything comes from something, and if everything were contingent, then there would have to be a time when nothing existed. And nothing would exist because nothing would have caused it to come about. But things do exist, so there must have been a necessary object that was not contingent that caused everything to come into being. So potentially there could be a plethora of necessary things, but then we would have to ask ourselves, how did they come into existence? So either it is a necessary thing which got its necessity from some other necessary thing, or it's something that is necessary in its essence, it's necessary on its own. Once again, the series cannot go on indefinitely, so Aquinas is going to posit that there must be a being that is existent necessarily and gets its necessary existence from itself. Whatever that necessary being might be, it is in the neighborhood of God. Okay? So, in the first way, we have that God is an unmoved mover. In the second way, we have that God is an uncaused causer. And in the third way, we have that God is a non-contingent necessary being that doesn't really have the nice phrasing of unmoved mover or uncaused causer. Uncontingent continger? Yeah, let's go with uncontingent continger. Not that that's really a word, but hey, it's funny and that's what matters. Okay? Now, the fourth argument is different. The fourth way talks about this idea of the gradation of things. And you'll recall that Aristotle is very concerned with this idea that human beings talk to one another and that our language practices tell us something real about the world, okay? And it seems that not only do human beings talk, but human beings make judgments about things. Like, I really like that nail polish, or that's a really nice skirt that you're wearing. Okay, well, when I say that's a beautiful skirt that you're wearing, I'm making a judgment, right? And that implies that there would be skirts out there that would be less aesthetically pleasing, and potentially that there may be skirts out there that are more aesthetically pleasing. And when somebody comes up to you and says, that's a nice skirt that you're wearing, Lauren, you don't say, oh, well, what standard of beauty are you applying here? You just accept the compliment, right? So on Aquinas' view, there is, when we make these claims about something being good or something being beautiful, that implies that there is a gradation of things, that there's a scale, and that certain things are going to be higher on that scale, you know, the skirt that you're wearing, and certain things are going to be lower on that scale, you know, some really ugly skirt that you would have never thought to buy. So notice that Aquinas is not making the claim that you must know what the standard is or what the maximum is in order for us to be persuaded that it exists, okay? So I don't have to believe that there is the most beautiful skirt that exists that I can understand in order for me to say that nevertheless I make value judgments and you all agree and understand that I make these value judgments, and therefore it must be the case that a scale exists. So Aquinas' argument is going to be that if we take the maximum of all maximums, that is in the neighborhood of God.
The maximum of all maximum?
So if making these judgments required that we know the maximum, then we could know what the cause directly, say supreme reality. And that would be problematic in the sense that his strategy in the previous three ways is to talk about the effect of God, because we don't have any way of accessing the cause of God. Or if we did, then arguments for God's existence would no longer be necessary, right? Okay. And And then we have the argument from the governance of the world, all right? Now, we all take for granted that the world is an orderly place. So, for example, I think you said that you're studying biology, and when you study the sciences, you have this idea that experiments are verifiable, right? So if Cheyenne does an experiment and he follows the protocol in a certain way, and then George comes along and does the experiment in the same way, that they should get the same results. And if they don't get reproducible results, then that means that there was something flawed with the experiment, right? Now, let's say that George reproduces Cheyenne's experiment and the results come back completely different. And Cheyenne comes back and says, well, that's because the world has changed since George did his experiment. We would all say,
What's the experiment?
well,
That's what I was saying.
Yeah, but that's violating the laws right here. So.
we would say that's violating the laws of science here. Well, what makes the laws of science work? In part, it's that we presume that the world is an orderly place, okay? And Aquinas is going to say it's an orderly place because it was designed to be an orderly place. Now, if you were to pick up a book on does God exist of any sort, many of the strategies that you would see employed in trying to answer this question would fall under the category of the argument from intelligent design. And you might read these people and think, oh wow, how wise they are, and how did they possibly come up with this idea? And then you come to an introduction to philosophy class, and you realize that there are no new ideas in the world, and what these people are doing is just recycling the fifth way from Aquinas. They've just updated the science a little bit. And that's, by the way, one of the reasons why I really like studying philosophy, because it makes me feel really smart when somebody says, oh, here's this brand new argument, and I can say, that's not new. Aquinas came up with that hundreds of years ago, and let me show you what the original formulation of it looks like. So, you have probably heard some formulation of the argument from intelligent design. It's sometimes referred to as the teleological argument, but essentially, it falls under this category of you witness an arrow going towards the target. And the arrow appears to behave intelligently as it is heading towards the target, right? It doesn't zig and then zag and then go up and then go down and kind of go around and then just fall. It heads towards the target and then it reaches the target and sinks in. Now, that intelligent behavior cannot possibly be attributed to the arrow itself. Right, arrows don't have the kind of neurological capacity that we associate with intelligence, for one. So what we do is we attribute that to the result of the arrow behaving in an intelligent way onto the archer who shot the arrow in an intelligent way. So in the same way, natural bodies such as rocks behave in a way that has orderly results. Rocks fall downward, and this tendency contributes to the orderliness of the world. If rocks sometimes fell sideways, then we would not live in an orderly world, and we wouldn't be able to make sense of the world. Okay? So basically, Aquinas' view is that the world exhibits orderliness. That is to say, a design, a rational orderliness of things. And in order for that to be the case, there must have been a designer that designed the world to have these properties. And once again, that designer is in the neighborhood of God.
would you attribute an IR guarded or a heat-seeking missile as an intelligent object, or the person who created it?
I'm sorry?
I'm curious about this. If you had a heat-seeking missile, is the missile intelligent, or is the person who created it intelligent?
What about artificial intelligence?
Yeah.
Okay, let me take those questions.
Separately.
Well, I don't know, they are sort of
That's this.
similar questions. So
Yeah.
part of it is, when we talk about artificial intelligence,
Yeah.
the question is the object that is exhibiting the intelligence intelligent, or are we seeing a reflection of the intelligence of the person who initially designed the object? And that is the similar question
Yeah.
with the heat-seeking
Right.
missile, right?
I was trying to
So
think
I
of
see
something.
that the missile is behaving in a way that seems intelligent, and I look at the missile and I say, okay, what about this missile is behaving intelligently? Is it something about the missile itself? Or does the intelligence come from that which created
It
the
has
missile?
it has a chip that's constantly in a feedback loop looking for heat signature on its sensor. So it has all the properties of intelligence except for conscious thought. We would normally attribute to something else. It's got an input, it's got a computation, and it's got a reaction. I think that's
And-
intelligence.
I mean, artificial intelligence can technically learn things. Like the iPhone 4S can learn your personality, which I think is really weird, but
That's whitewash though.
That doesn't really learn. I've used Siri for a while, and I don't think it really
Well,
learns.
I mean, I've used different people's iPhones, and it'll respond differently.
Oh.
based
Well, I
on-
mean, so
I'm
there's
just trying
something to be
figure out
said
the
for, the question that we're now moving to is, what is intelligence,
definition.
right? And there's something to be said for, is intelligence merely responding to a stimulus?
I believe so.
And I don't think that that is the case, okay? So, for example, if I'm sitting down and you take a little tiny hammer and you hit my knee in the right spot, what's going to happen?
The knee-jerk
Reflex.
The knee-jerk reflex, right? I'm going to kick you. Now, is that intelligent on my part?
Yes,
No,
it's a
No.
nerve. It's a nerve that's reacting to being hit.
it's not necessarily intelligent though.
I
It's
think-
just,
I think it's the
throwing
definition
a
of
rock
intelligence
doesn't
we're
make
trying to
the
figure
rock.
out.
Let her finish.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
it's a natural reaction, it's not necessarily something from intelligence. Intelligence is more of, you can take in information, process it, and then give something else back.
Right, the brain is taken that the nerve is the reaction.
Your brain is actually not.
Your brain's not.
Involved.
It's literally
I thought-
you're just literally hitting that spot and it is
It's
automatically
actually a
reacting.
tendon, I don't think it's a nerve, right?
Is it intended? Okay, but I was wondering, I thought it was a nerve. Well, it might change a little bit, but I still think it's an intelligence because it is a reaction to stimulus. Now, I may not attribute a brain to being in here, in the tendon, but it's still burning energy to do something. Whether or not it's intelligent.
Well, so I think that the
I'm
difference
coming from that.
between
Yeah.
intelligence and programming, personally, is that intelligence can say, I'm going to choose to do differently here,
Mhm.
right? So a heat-seeking missile is only capable of seeking heat,
Right.
and it can't do anything else. But if you tell a human, seek this target, the human is able to think about things like, is it legitimate for me to be seeking this target?
Right.
Does this target have children that might miss it if it dies? Has a trial gone on to show that this target is legitimate? Whereas a missile doesn't have that kind of broader intelligence. Now, I understand what you guys are saying here because there are computer programs out there that can learn in the sense of playing backgammon, okay? So it turns out that you can use what's called a Hebbian network to set up a program to play backgammon. And what a Hebbian network does is basically say, if a certain
Backgammon?
strategy, pardon?
Right?
Backgammon, the game backgammon.
That's-
What a Hebbian network can do is basically say, okay, if a certain strategy is successful, make that connection stronger. And if a certain strategy is not successful, make that connection weaker. And then you can take a program that has never played a game of backgammon and have it play backgammon over and over and over again, and eventually that program will become a better backgammon player than any human backgammon player. Now the question becomes, is that intelligence? One. And two, is that intelligence being displayed by the program, or is it being displayed by the programmer?
It's just doing what it was designed to do.
Okay, well, it turns out, I haven't seen how your iPhone was programmed, and I don't know. But my guess is that it's using some sort of Hebbian network or Hebbian network-like programming in order to function. So what's happened is that your iPhone has caught on to certain patterns, like Blaine mistypes this word on a regular basis. And so when you begin typing this word, knowing that you're going to push a button to autocorrect, once it's strengthened that node of the network sufficiently, it turns it into an automatic function.
Okay, well, since we're talking about this, would you say that animals and plants are unintelligent, since they're basically just instinctual things?
Well, once again, these are complicated questions,
Yes.
okay? And I'm not necessarily going to say this is a definitive answer, or even this is my definitive answer. I choose to, to say that I might change my mind 10 minutes from now. But one of the things that I can tell you is that I do think that choices and choosing have something to do with intelligence. And I do notice about animals that they choose whether or not to comply with your commands, right? So sometimes you tell your dog to sit and you've got a treat in your pocket and she sits. And sometimes you tell your dog to sit and you have a treat in your pocket.
If you starve the dog, he'll always come for the treat.
Okay, well,
We're not about
starving dogs.
I can tell my ex to make me a sandwich all day, she'll never make it. But if I ask her sweetly, she'll make it. It's about stresses. That's what I'm saying. It's about we're reacting to stimulus stresses. I'm serious. You starve a dog and he doesn't eat a treat, there's something wrong with the dog, and it's a disease. But same with the person. The person will act the same way. You enslave them, you take all the sleep away, don't feed them for a while. They'll change their mind about anything you want them to as soon as you give them food.
Sounds like torture.
That's exactly what
It is torture, but there are some subjects that don't break under torture conditions.
I think that's what we attribute to an insanity. Actually, I attribute it to an insanity. Like, I would be insane if I sat there and thought, well, I could rather live or I could stand up to my principles and die with them. Well, that's insane, but it's what I'd rather do. I'm not saying there's a right or wrong. I think that's an insanity.
But I do think that, to borrow from Aquinas,
Mhm.
somewhere in the neighborhood of that is intelligence.
I think
In
so.
the sense that I do think that intelligence is about the ability not to just respond to stimulus,
Yes.
but to choose how you respond to a certain stimulus.
The reason I'm
So,
Or
I
not
mean,
to.
granted, there's going to be a way in which I'm going to have a Pavlovian response,
Mhm.
right? If I've been conditioned, say, to be afraid, then for me to break out of that conditioning is going to be really, really, really difficult. But as a human being, I can choose to reflect upon my experiences
Mhm.
and then say, okay, this is the way that I've been behaving, and I'm going to choose to do differently. And please understand that your mileage may vary on this. So Kant, for example, is going to say that human beings believe themselves to have free will, but we can never be certain of the fact that we do indeed have free will,
Yeah.
right? He's going to say that whether or not we have free will belongs to the noumenal world, along with whether or not we have a soul, whether God exists, and the thing in itself.
The reason I ask is I'm trying to find a clear definition of where intelligence starts and stops for understanding as opposed